The title of my paper is The Contemporary, or What is Modernism, What is Modernity? And before I begin, I'd just like to extend my deepest gratitude to Elise Apaitis for curating today's panel. Discourse in 2010 symptomatized the usual anxiety about contemporary cultural production. Numerous questionnaires, among them those posed by eFlux in October, sought categorical criteria for differentiating artistic practices in the geometric growth of biennials and art fairs. The questionnaires also looked for some sense of relevance that contemporary practice and its heterogeneity may have for the future. October editor Hal Foster, who recently called for the term of, quote, provisional autonomy in design and crime, accused contemporary art of floating free from history. The retroactively assigned spokesman for a form of autonomy often collapsed with modernism could have reminded Foster that no attempt at dispensing with historical determination is ever possible. Here is the authoritarian voice of autonomy we think we all recognize, but we often forget, Theodore Adorno. Quote, there is no material content, no formal category of creation, however mysteriously transmitted, in itself unaware of its process, which did not originate from the empirical reality from which it breaks, end quote. Reminding us that autonomy, provisional or otherwise, is always an index of a historical horizon. Now, it's the horizon itself that is what is at stake, as opposed to art forms that operate as indices of it, in the legitimation crisis of the present. Art stitched to the gravity of history is not what is missing, but more fundamentally, a sense of a shared historical horizon, a common world. That, quote, common, indeed the commons, are shattered by aforementioned relativism and its twin, privatization. The commons therefore seem old-fashioned, archaic, irrelevant. To await a culture to come, first, one must wait for a people to come. In this regard, Tahrir and the interrupted Arab Spring of about 6 months ago, as well as Occupy Wall Street at present, offer a glimmer of this people to come and culture to come. In the interim, the present, beset by, again, a legitimation crisis, and its future hide under the disguise of regression. Had Foster looked elsewhere, other than at the relational and participatory practices that have dominated for 2 decades, he may have found indices of a necessary interlace between a common world we inhabit globally and its cultural practices. Indeed, in the dissonance generated by responses to those questionnaires, one common idea surfaced. We cannot apprehend contemporaneity from the vantage of contemporaneity. If we have a world in common, we cannot yet see it. We share this position of standing in our own blind spot with history. In 1928, Walter Benjamin collected a set of aphorisms under the title One-Way Street, conceived as a drive through the cultural landscape of shattered perspectives enfolded in the tissue of time and space with no vantage from which to be viewed. The text's fragmentary form telegraphs its claims with rigor and urgency. The present may not be coherently framed, but by a future. In One-Way Street, Benjamin already looks ahead to his future, or to his theses on the philosophy of history, written 12 years later, in which he once again argues that the past, encrypted fossil-like, becomes only momentarily legible, only to a future it cannot know. Others have drawn Benjamin's model of history into the present. Giorgio Agamben's What is the Contemporary, written after September the 11th, defines the contemporary as that which can never be present to itself. The contemporary subject, subjected to this inability to gain a perspective, is agonizingly aware of her own excess and lack. She traverses the cultural terrain in an attempt to decipher a hidden past that would make a future possible. The present talk will focus on contemporary practitioners Jeanne Thompson, Florian Pumholzl, and Sarah Crowner. And I'd just like to announce, I just found out about this myself yesterday, that Jeanne Thompson will have an exhibit at the List here at MIT opening in February. But that's a pure coincidence, and perhaps that coincidence is itself symptomatic. Thompson, Pumholzl, and Crowner, under the camouflage of repetition and seemingly empty abstraction, are willing to think about basic problem sets with which cultural practice has struggled during the period known as modernism. Problems other than autonomy, flatness, medium, or any of the other platitudes we associate with modernism. Modernity qualified the collective subject, the masses, as a function of labor refracted through time. Formal issues in representation internalize the logic of remunerative labor. Georges Seurat, saw the brushstroke as a form of distribution, while Edouard Manet, by the 1880s, conceded to the brushstroke as so much currency, a general equivalent circulating over the canvas surface. These issues were dropped at the close of the 19th century in the face of the division, the artificial division, between tautologically understood self-reflexivity on the one hand and design or craft on the other. Modernism, as it was handed down to a post-World War II American practice, became about the status of objects in relation to other objects of industrial and post-industrial fabrication. Most notably, we could all be thinking of the ready-made. The methods with which contemporary artists resurrect the issue of work are rarely recognized precisely because they take place at the level of process rather than reference, and can therefore be dismissed as purely formal. I would like to follow these artists' lead and consider the subject who makes and works, the performative dimension of making inscribed in the made object rather than merely the object. For Georges Seurat in the mid-1880s, and I show you the models dating to 1886, a pretty familiar image. Art in general and paint in particular had become a function of monetized labor. Seurat charged for his work by the hour, in solidarity with the unskilled model exposed to fatigue and corrosive boredom for an hourly wage. Although that information remains outside the frame, modernity understood as circulating currency is articulated by the mechanized brushstroke. In lockstep with the acceleration of contemporary capital, painter Jeanne Thompson intensifies the implications of the applied paint, drawing our distracted attention to the constituent elements of labor, of contemporary labor, through the mark charted against time. The hours of the day, the days of the work week spent in the studio. I'm showing you Chronochrome set 1 on the right there, dating to just last year. In Chronochromes, Thompson uses the Munsell chromatic system, named for Albert Henry Munsell, the American painter who devised a way to denote color through numbers and dimensionally. This color grammar, as Munsell called it, was adopted by the USDA in the 1930s and is now used by the company X-Rite, who, whether we know it or not, underlies many of the sources of color that we deal with every day, from crayons to house paints to cosmetic colors to pretty much any time we're engaged in the purchasing of a chromatic quantity, we owe our experience to X-Rite. Incidentally, one thing that Thompson works on is that the that color, one of the very last commons, could be enclosed within the bounds of proprietorial copyright. Munsell's code rationalizes color according to three numerically descriptive categories: hue, saturation, and value. Thompson pushes the apotheosis of efficient rationalism, Munsell's efficient rationalism, by mapping it onto the calendar. Each day has a complementary hue pair, each hour changes the color's value, and each month the saturation changes. Noon is absolutely white, and midnight is absolute black. The color system interpolates, preceding the practitioner, who has no choice. Painting becomes a chart. According to Thompson's statement, quote, "This provides a system of producing paintings which would register fatigue, boredom, distraction, and interruptions. As in theory, it has the potential to produce a smooth gradient that would represent the continuous flow of time," end quote. The key in that statement for me is the word theory. Theory in contradistinction to practice. An abstract system negatively registers the concretized embodiment of the subject who paints. That embodiment slides under codes, articulated by fatigue. At the same time, the abstract expressionist mark, long ago abandoned on the trash heap of history, turns inside out. The subject finds himself in his fatigue rather than the plenitude of the mark. Yet Thompson's dismantled mark does not conclude with absence, aporia, or any of the terms favored by post-structuralism and relevant to 50s painting. Instead, his apparent mimicry of industrial manufacture becomes an inverse of Taylorism. It marks the spot where life inserts itself, where the painter retrieves an uneasy agency. I tire, therefore I am. I am not a turbine nor a computer. Through its limits, the human stain surfaces. Fatigue, again, is not analogous to void, to emptiness, entropy, or any of the other spectacular terms frequently projected onto Thompson in the extant literature. The work is not an endgame, but an acknowledgement of the vicissitudes of production in a late capitalist economy in which life is absolutely managed, if not totally ready-made. Here, that old blue chip around which modernist vision was traded, the unit of paint applied to a surface, otherwise known in the jargon as a grapheme, defies the assumption that dissolving the practitioner's hand could ever truly challenge art's tendency to becoming a commodity fetish. Far from a site of originary genius, the mark results from a grain of a surface manufactured elsewhere. The grapheme, understood now as rote, through which the self recognizes himself in exhaustion, identifies with the anonymous work that made the surface available in the art supply store. In this sense, emphasis is taken off the object of manufacture, the terrain of the ready-made, and put on the nameless and faceless subject of expropriated labor. To contextualize, the standard history of late modernist painting, in the history of late modernist painting, from Johns through Stella and Warhol, that narrative, that telos, is understood to be about the painter's testing of limited possibilities in the face of a preconstituted surface. Thierry de Duve, in Kant after Duchamp, argued long ago that 50s painting was the result of a cross-contamination of painting and ready-made, object and process. Put otherwise, the act of depositing pigment on a cloth surface demonstrated either hopeless naivete or perpetual struggle against the subject's absorption into pre-given matrices, from the square frame to the blank canvas. The chronochromes take their place in a history of tension between the surface as a template and the mark as a site of agency. Johns had said, as we all know, quote, "I painted the American flag because I dreamt the American flag," pointing to the circuit between the unconscious and ideology, limiting the freedom of mark making, and spoofing the American Catechism of unmediated freedom. Warhol, in the pissing contest among generations of male artists, said that he painted, quote, painted Campbell soup because he ate Campbell soup, further embedding choices in passive consumption and market determination. Moving ahead to Thompson's work, and again accelerated in keeping with the dictates of the present, the mark is close to total self-effacement, but it isn't complete self-effacement. There is agency, an agency now extricated from any sense of individuality. The relationship between cut, the shape of the surface, and the mark opens onto or suggests collective labor. The shape of the paintings are, quote, constituted by a fundamentally arbitrary slice into an industrial loom's more or less infinite capacity for production. Typically, this inaugural cut allows for an initial suppression of laboring bodies, which produced the linen, end quote. Thompson's A monument, not anti-monument, is to faceless labor, to which he addends his share of work, for better or worse. Whether this constitutes reification or not is, of course, up for debate. Johns and Warhol acknowledge the ready-made, not the industrial labor that generates it. And that's the crucial differentiation I'd like to make. In 20th century painting, the painterly mark dwindled under a kind of duress that articulates the condition of expression for everyone, artist or otherwise, a kind of aphasia at the level of mark making, accelerated by post-industrial economies. This is happening sooner and sooner. So I'm showing Crayola's new product line entitled Wonder Color, in which chroma, the pigment, is only picked up by Crayola's own papers. So he or she who's drawing and coloring can't make a mark on any other surface than that sold by Crayola. So clearly this is already beginning when the subject is not even 6 months of age. Abstract as modernist painting appeared to be, it indexed the very concrete conditions of everyone. To remind you, we don't recognize ourselves in our marks. We hit squares to say something, we move our cursor and our digitally mediated images in an electronic matrix. The logic of the cursor, as demonstrated here, starts earlier and earlier. Thompson is asking, what would it look like to put pressure on the cursor through the laughably outdated matrix of paint? In the Chronochrome series, the grapheme at once pathetically persists against the digital zeros and ones with whom it competes and risks becoming interchangeable with them. Yet, when not derealized on a PowerPoint, the mark, negatively via fatigue, reactivates a moment when the cultural left had not advocated dematerialization. On the other side of modernism's arc, its inception in the 19th century, anarchists, Marxists like Pyotr Kropotkin, whom the divisionists were reading in a reading group, a Monday night reading group held in Signac's studio, and Félix Fénéon, supporter of Seurat, advocated skilled artisanal labor, craft, process, as a place where the subject could produce and self-realize without being subsumed into machinic anonymity, or in today's terms, the shuffle of data, information, which is the current commodity fetish. I'm quoting Kropotkin. The mass of workers who are today mere machines will become living beings and apply to industry intuition sustained by study and informed by manual skill, end quote. While Thompson's terms laboring bodies rather than laboring people or laboring subjects invokes mere machines who make the fabric on which he paints in sweatshops across the global south, It could apply just as well to art installers, cubicle workers, leisure industry workers, all the little shop girls about whom Krakauer has told us so much, gallery girls, etc., etc. Thompson's studio slog superficially looks conventional because it happens in solitude, in a studio, when everything now is supposed to happen in groups over food on site. It's the inverse of many celebrated, genuinely regressive contemporary practices. You might consider the instant classic, The Faith That Moves Mountains, for which Belgian-Mexican artist Francis Alice, arriving in Peru, solicited volunteers to move a sand dune. In the neo-colonial fantasy, is this neo-colonial fantasy that different from the corporation given the status of the individual, a status the subject continually loses in the face of corporate consolidation of power? In other words, I'm suggesting that this is a kind of neo-feudalism that is in lockstep with hegemonic economies now. The contemporary is often understood to post-date modernism and post-date postmodernism, the latter variously defined. Recent theoretical discourse has questioned this timeline, suggesting that modernity, and given their symbiotic relationship, of course, modernism, may have been as precarious and incomplete as the putative contemporary. Jürgen Habermas has descriptively posited modernity as an unfinished project, while others have called for modernity's continuity in the interest of recognizing uneven development and, on a cultural register, the persistent search for the right to subjectivity in underdeveloped geopolitical contexts. And then against both positions are those who claim modernity's fictional status. Bruno Latour argues in his very influential We Have Never Been Modern that the central tenets of modernity, among them a nature and culture binary, among them the centrality of the subject, were at best fictions constitutive of the many economic and ecological disasters we confront now. Such counterclaims to a progressivist telos are themselves recurrent. We could think of Kubler's lighthouse flashes in the shape of time, or Huizinga's waves hitting the shore in the waning of the Middle Ages, two key examples. But squabbles over periodization, useful as they may be as curatorial or academic categories, need to look first at concrete practices struggling with historicity and with the present. I'm showing you a work entitled Diminution, dating to 2007. It's the work of Florian Pumholzl. His research, unlike Habermas's project, is not to enforce, and he's very vocal about this differentiation, is not to enforce an inevitable artificial transparency, but to continue modernism's project, a mining of subjectivity, itself a modern phenomenon, a result of which it has ceased to be centered and present to itself. The oft-quoted origin, if such there may be, of this condition is Rimbaud's provocative Je suis autre, or I am other. Of what or onto what this alterity opens remains to be thought. Line for Pumholzl becomes a medium of thinking without end, without an a priori system of organization. Only one consistent change occurs among the non-recursive transformation in his series. Drawing is a diminishment, an erasure, in both the extension of the graphic inscription and in the lightness of the pigment. This, of course, differentiates itself from a minimalist understanding of repetition in which each unit is transposable in a greater scheme. We could say it's more subjective. Moreover, this general tendency to diminution, to a reduction in size and the density of the mark, underscores for Pumholzl the question of portraiture. He has, again seemingly regressively, moved from historicist conceptual projects similar to those of Tacita Dean, to examining drawing once again, and the conventions inscribed in drawing, such as portraiture. He claims that he's revisiting portraiture and abstraction, specifically a historical iteration of abstract portraiture, that of Brancusi's portrait of James Joyce, published in an edition of Finnegan's Wake in 1939. Here, scale diminishes. Strikingly, intensity of pressure diminishes at the risk of absolute disappearance. A similar issue as in Thompson's chromatic mark. Finally, Sarah Crowner's composition number 19, which I show you on the left, also dating to 2010, limns the pathos of craft, which continues to be understood as a regressive anti-modernist return to an authenticity rooted in pre-industrial community. Even though weaving in its Bauhaus iteration is bound up with modernist form and modern technology. Crowner vaguely cites Hans Arp, whose work Avant ma naissance, a collage in paper, I'm showing you on the right. She trades paper for the coarse grain of fabric. On the one hand, Crowner's work repeats appropriation, a standard postmodern tactic itself founded on repetition. But she does it in an inexact way. Modernist form is badly appropriated. On the other hand, it frames craft quite literally as a term that predates modernism and is simultaneously resistant to the post-postmodern, post-Fordist, post-regime of dematerialization in which the fiction of originality is traded for copyright law. Despite the seeming criticality of conceptual and post-conceptual work, capital, of course, marched on ahead, bolstered by so many supposedly critical practices, onward toward a globalized system based on abstract data, abstract ideas, and on canned conviviality resting on invisible work. In other words, on service. Crowner's object acknowledges this economic history. It performs a complicated temporality, and the object becomes a compound fossil. Coarse-grained material, at once archaic and groundbreaking, is inscribed with traces of domestic and cheap industrial labor. Among the autonomists who have theorized the shift from disciplinary labor to flexible, precarious information and service industries, Silvia Federici is singular in addressing gendered forms of labor unbound by rationalized or modernist time. She theorizes domestic labor as a vestige of pre-industrial economies, which modernity did not change. It did not change archaic forms of accumulation, but manages to barely manage them. Domestic work is a kind of expropriated and invisible service labor that permits accumulation for those who already have property, or at least a proper name. Post-industrial work, in turn, thrives on a similar ambiguity, in which the laboring body is caught in a gray zone, abandoned by law, otherwise referred to by Foucault and Agamben as bare life. Especially now, after the 2010 US Supreme Court ruling entitled Citizens United, that granted the corporation the status of individual under the law, what happens to subjectivity unrepresented by the visibility of a logo? What happens to the 1 million women who brought a class action suit against Walmart and lost? 1 million subjects, so much collective life, is less than one individual. Walmart. Crowner's gauche thing internalizes this problem set, this crisis in production. It internalizes the contradictions of making and working, too irrelevant to glow with the charm of the romantic ruin, the surrealist objet trouvé, or the seduction of the obsolete. Crowner's surface networks the regress of a dowdy materialism, the glamour of design, and the disposability of both free domestic and cheap labor coded feminine and inscribed yet invisible in the object. At the same time, optimistically, Crowner holds on to a repertoire of form long abandoned, its potential unknown. The reference to ARP is neither ironic nor dismissive. Modernism, like modernity, is plural. As such, its potential remains nascent. One narrative, one, in this case, masculinist narrative, drew us to the post-postmodern, post-material now. What other contemporaneities lie dormant in history? The artistic practices shown here, that they are recursive, may be neither a function of vapidity nor defeat in the face of capital, as Berger insisted many, many years ago in Theory of the Avant-Garde, nor proof of the death of art so frequently announced. The materialist practices I chose to present today actualize a model of history in which a subject finds herself in a reworking of a past that opens onto a potential future.
Play from start. What?
Yeah. And then you can start.
Okay, yeah.
You start that at 12.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I will walk you through the latest exhibition I did, which opened 2 weeks ago. Closer? Closer. In Kassel, Germany, in the Friedrichshainum Kunsthalle, I think it's called. I was approached by the curator, Rein Wulfs, to do the exhibition at the whole Friedrichshainum, which is usually consisting of 2 or 3 solo exhibitions. So it was it was a very big place or space to deal with. And when Rein Wulfs approached me, he said that he have seen several of my exhibitions and that he entrusted me the whole space because he has seen that I've been able to deal with big empty spaces without necessarily putting a lot of works inside. The problem was that when people when people put me in a box, I tend to work against it. So I was obsessed with making a project that could basically fill out the whole space of Friedrichshainum. And in my simple mind, the only thing I really could come up with was to squeeze the Statue of Liberty inside of the exhibition place. Many times, I get a lot of stupid ideas, and a lot of them goes directly into the trash, but somehow this idea, I got obsessed with it and wanted at least to research more into it. And I think one of the main information that made me pursue the idea was that I discovered basically I didn't know anything about the Statue of Liberty before I got this idea. So during the research, I found out that the original technique of building the Statue of Liberty is in the technique of repoussé, which is that you are hammering very thin copper plates. And that the Statue of Liberty in New York is basically 2 millimeters thick, which is approximately 2 penny, the thickness of 2 pennies. And that generated like the whole, that basically constituted the piece, because I thought there was a certain beauty in reproducing the skin of Miss Liberty. And what you see on the picture is basically the inside of the Statue of Liberty, and it's the negative form of it. It's taken by the National Park Service during the restoration of her in 1984. This is archival drawing of the staircase in the pedestal that is used to look up the skirt of the Statue of Liberty. It illustrates the ascent and descent of in the pedestal. So in creating the exhibitions, I tend to consider exhibition places as, it comes from the simple fact that I don't have a studio, so I don't work in studios, but, instead the exhibition place becomes like a test site for putting things together in order to make them speak. For the Frisianum, I decided to use like the image of Edward White, the first American man in space. It's a folded poster. You see a picture later. And on the note card, that's the title of the show, which is basically July the 4th, 1776, in Roman letter. And that's a copy of the like what's written on the tablet of the Statue of Liberty. It's all written through the typewriter of Theodore Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber. The image we use as well for the kiosk around the city, it's a cropped image of Edward White. Let me see. Oh, this is the photographer that takes picture of the first work you see when you're entering the space. Maybe I should also mention that for the press release, I decided to use the original version of Cinderella in German. It was actually made on site from the Brother Grimms, and the original version is a bit more bloody than Disney's version, and I always was attracted to it. I'm not sure if you're aware that in the original version, the sisters of Cinderella, they would one would chop off the heel in order to fit into the shoes, and the other one would chop off the toes in order to fit the Princess Dream. And I was always attracted to these figures because it was in a way so much more real than Cinderella that's sitting there in all her goodness, waiting for the dream to come true. And in the back of these 4 pages, Cinderella story, I added like a quotation handwritten by most of my family, which says, "Modern society uses various forms of propaganda to teach people to be frightened and horrified by violence because the techno-industrial society needs a population that is timid, docile, and afraid of assert itself, a population that will not make trouble or disrupt the orderly functioning of the system. Power depends ultimately on physical force. By teaching people that violence is wrong, except of course when the system itself uses violence via the police or military, the system maintains its monopoly on physical force and those keeps all power in its own hands." And when you enter the Frisianum is basically 2 floors. So you enter the first floor, which is what you see is the a pile of 2 millimeter copper plates that's not been that's not been hammered yet. And there would be a newspaper. This is actually only a crop of the newspaper, but it's a newspaper from 1945 announcing the wedding of Barbara Pierce to George Bush. And the other one was the typewriter of Theodore Kaczynski, which recently was sold by the FBI on auction through the GSA auction house, which is a governmental auction house that basically expropriating property and reselling it. On the second floor, since I only decided to rebuild the skin and not the skeleton of the Statue of Liberty, it of course cannot be assembled, and yeah, I mean there was some practical decision in it, which was more related to the since there was a lot of people in the process. I mean, during the research of having it like decisions of where to build it, the initial decision was in China, not only for economical reason, but also when we approached like the French company that basically was restoring her in '84, they wanted to charge extra for the patronymy that they thought they somehow owned. That was one of the decisions where I thought I needed like to have this built really far away from these kind of ideas at least. What we copied initially is a IKEA strategy, since the biggest cost to have things produced in China is the transportation. We decided like that the form of her is basically a IKEA strategy, that it should be related to the volume of the containers in order to save transportation cost. This is just installation views of the upper floors of Friedrichshainum. And I mean, there were some tires and things that we used for the installation, but basically all of the things were a part of the transportation that things were wrapped with, and we used it to balance things because it's the copper is very fragile, so we needed like to balance them in order to have them sustain their forms. Yeah, I think that's the last picture. I think we can, yeah, that was it. That was very fast.